Lake Haven, Michigan, was the kind of town that seemed to exist solely to fill space on the map. With just over 8,000 residents, the place consisted of a downtown area with half a dozen shops, an abandoned park, and a movie theater that only operated on weekends. Life there was as predictable as the sunrise, which, for me, wasn't particularly thrilling. My name is Matt, 27 years old, an IT technician. My job involved fixing broken computers and dealing with customers who always started their sentences with, "I didn't touch anything," and the computer just stopped working. It was a dull, monotonous routine until the day something different showed up in town. It was Amanda, my coworker, who noticed it first. During our coffee break, she pointed to a newly posted flyer on the bulletin board at the cafe across from the computer shop where we worked. The Theater of Tragedy, a unique and exclusive spectacle. The words were printed in gold letters on a black background, adorned with illustrations of classic theatrical masks. One smiling, the other crying. The flyer felt out of place, like it belonged to another time, another world. "Look at this, Matt. When was the last time anyone did something fun around here?" Amanda asked, excited. "Fun?" Tyler, another technician, scoffed as he joined us. "This looks like just another way to make us pay for something boring." I smiled, but deep down the flyer intrigued me. Below the description it read, "One night only, at the old Mayfair Theater." The Mayfair was a relic from better days, an abandoned theater in the town center that had been closed for over a decade. The building had been partially swallowed by time, but still had an oddly imposing aura. "It's better than rewatching sitcom reruns alone at home," I suggested, half joking. "How about we go?" Amanda shrugged. "Sure, at least it's something different. Why not?" Tyler agreed, crossing his arms. On the night of the spectacle, the temperature had dropped, and the wind howled through the deserted streets. The Mayfair was more impressive than I remembered. Red and gold lights illuminated the facade, and the entrance was decorated with candles and velvet curtains. A small crowd gathered near the ticket booth, eager to enter. Inside, the lobby had been refurbished, though it still bore the weight of abandonment. The red carpet was worn, and the walls exuded a faint smell of mildew mixed with a sickly sweet perfume. That's when we saw the sign. It was positioned near the doors leading to the main auditorium, illuminated by a flickering yellow light. Made of dark wood with hand-carved golden letters, the message was clear: "Welcome to the Theater of Tragedy." But before entering, please read the rules. "Rules? That's new." Amanda laughed, stepping closer to read them. The rules were laid out in a numbered list. Tyler began reading them aloud in his usual mocking tone. Rule number 1. Keep your eyes fixed on the stage at all times. Do not look away, not even for a second. What kind of theater forces the audience to watch? Tyler remarked. Rule number 2. Do not speak during the performance, not even to ask for help. Any voice not part of the play will be silenced permanently. Silenced permanently? Amanda repeated, raising an eyebrow. Is that supposed to be a threat? Honestly, this rule would be useful in movie theaters too. Rule number 3. Applaud whenever the cast finishes a scene. Oh, sure, or the director might get upset, Tyler joked. Rule number 4. Do not touch anyone during the performance, not even to try to help them. That sounds a bit extreme, I commented, frowning. Rule number 5. If anything or anyone in the theater seems strange, do not react. That's basically this town's motto. Amanda grinned. Rule number 6. If you see someone who resembles the devil in the audience, ignore them. They're just a special guest. Their eyes never blink, but you don't want them to look directly at you. What is this? A cheap attempt to scare me? Tyler said, laughing. Rule number 7. Never, under any circumstances, try to leave the theater before the show ends. The doors will only open after the final applause. Any attempt to escape will be considered part of the script. This one's my favorite, Amanda said, laughing. "They really want to make sure we stay till the end, huh?" Although we found the rules strange, none of us took them seriously. Perhaps it was just part of the theatrical experience, an attempt to create an immersive atmosphere. At least that's what we preferred to believe. We entered the auditorium, and the doors closed behind us with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. The lights were dimmed, and the stage was concealed by a black curtain. "Welcome to the Theater of Tragedy," a deep, enigmatic voice announced. The show was about to begin. If we had known what awaited us, we'd never have stepped foot in that place. The auditorium lights went out with a sharp snap, and an oppressive silence engulfed the room. It wasn't the kind of comfortable silence that precedes a performance. It was heavy, suffocating, as if something invisible were holding everyone's breath. For a few moments, the stage remained completely dark. Then, a red light flickered on, outlining the black curtain that covered the set. It was drawn aside with a metallic screech, revealing the first scene. At the center of the stage stood a round table covered with a white cloth stained in several places by what looked like wine or blood. 3 chairs were arranged around the table, but only one was occupied. A man sat there, dressed in a flawless black suit, his posture rigid. His head was bowed, and his pale hands held something that resembled a pocket watch. For some reason, it was impossible to look away from him. His presence seemed to exude an invisible force that kept everyone glued to the stage. "They really nailed the atmosphere," Amanda whispered beside me, but I didn't respond. Suddenly, the man on stage lifted his head. His face was strange. It was hard to pinpoint exactly why, but it seemed both human and inhuman, like a mask that didn't quite fit. His small, deep-set eyes gleamed under the stage lights. When he spoke, his voice was deep and resonant, as if it didn't come just from his throat, but from the entire room around us. "Welcome to the Theater of Tragedy. Tonight, each of you will be a witness, and perhaps something more." The man began pacing around the table as other actors emerged from the shadows. There were 3 in total: a woman in an old-fashioned dress with a black veil covering her face, a tall, thin man wearing a cracked wooden mask, and a small, hunched figure with disproportionately long fingers. They spoke in a nearly hypnotic tone, taking turns narrating a fragmented story. It was something about a card game with death, a lost bet, and a clock that never stopped. The words were vague but strangely vivid, as if they were buried memories in the mind of every spectator. The scene reached its climax as all the characters took their seats at the table. They began pounding their hands on the tabletop in a slow rhythm, which quickened until it resembled a heartbeat spiraling out of control. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as the rules dictated, the audience began to clap. Some applauded enthusiastically, others hesitantly, but no one seemed willing to defy the directive. I clapped too, though something inside me was beginning to feel uneasy. There was something wrong with that play, something I couldn't quite understand yet. In the 3rd row, directly in front of us, a man began to fidget. He was large, wearing a denim jacket that seemed too tight for his frame. He looked around nervously as the applause continued. The man in the 3rd row, visibly uncomfortable, tried to stand, but the woman next to him grabbed his arm, attempting to restrain him. "I'm leaving. This is too weird," he muttered, ignoring her. The moment he stood up, the theater's lights flickered and went out again. The auditorium was swallowed by total darkness. Then I heard it, a wet, almost organic sound like flesh being torn apart. A scream cut through the darkness but was abruptly silenced, turning into a muffled, gurgling noise. When the lights came back on, the man was back in his seat, but not as before. His head was tilted back at an impossible angle, as if his neck had been broken. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of sheer terror, and blood slowly dripped from a deep gash that ran from ear to ear. The audience, however, did not react with shock or horror. On the contrary, they began clapping again, this time with even more fervor. Laughter and whistles filled the auditorium, as though this was the highlight of the performance. "This can't be real," Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible, but I could feel the fear in it. On stage, the man in the black suit raised a glass that hadn't been there before. He looked directly at the audience and toasted, a sinister smile on his lips. "A sacrifice for the spectacle," he declared calmly. That's when I understood. The rules weren't just a warning, they were a sentence. And breaking them didn't just mean leaving the theater. It meant becoming part of the macabre narrative they were enacting. The true performance had begun. After the abrupt end of the first act, the tension in the theater became almost unbearable. The dead man in the third row remained seated, as still as a grotesque statue. No one reacted. The audience stayed in their seats as if nothing had happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Amanda shifting uneasily beside me. Her hand trembled slightly as she gripped the armrest of her chair. "Matt, this can't be real, can it?" she whispered. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears, and the image of the lifeless man in the third row was burned into my mind. But before I could think of a response, the stage lights came back on. The curtain was drawn back, revealing a new set. The stage now depicted a lavish dining room, but with unsettling details. The long table at the center was covered with an immaculate white cloth, adorned with gleaming silverware and crystal goblets filled with a thick red liquid. But something was wrong with the food. The platters were piled with what looked like human body parts. Arms, legs, something that appeared to be ribs. The same three actors from the first act were seated at the table, now dressed in extravagant, almost grotesque party attire. The veiled woman lifted her head, partially revealing a pale, disfigured face. "The feast is served," the man in the black suit announced, raising a goblet. Meanwhile, something strange began happening in the audience. Tyler, who had been silent until then, started murmuring. At first, I thought he was grumbling, as he often did, but the tone was too low, almost like a chant. "Tyler," Amanda called, but he didn't respond. I looked at him and felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were fixed on the stage, but they were glassy, expressionless. His lips moved rapidly, forming words I couldn't understand. "Hey, man, what are you saying?" I touched his shoulder, but he didn't react. It was as if he were in a trance. "Don't," Amanda said, her voice trembling. "The rules? You can't touch him." I swallowed hard and pulled my hand back, turning my attention back to the stage. On stage, the actors began eating the meat on the table in an exaggerated, grotesque manner, like ravenous animals. It was both repulsive and mesmerizing. The man in the black suit stood up and walked toward the audience, his eyes gleaming with what seemed like excitement. "Who will be the next to join the feast?" he asked, grinning broadly. Before anyone could react, a woman in the audience began to scream. She was seated in the front row, an elderly lady with gray hair who seemed completely unhinged. "I want to get out of here. I can't stay here. This is a nightmare." She tried to stand, but immediately, the theater's spotlights focused on her. Silence fell over the auditorium, and the applause stopped. The actors on stage froze in place like wax figures. Then, the veiled woman stood slowly, pointing at the lady in the audience. "The feast demands a sacrifice," she said in a raspy, reverberating voice. Before any of us could understand what was happening, the floor beneath the woman began to give way, as if it were made of rotted wood. Her legs sank first, and she started screaming, thrashing frantically. "Someone help me, please." The rules echoed in my mind. Do not touch anyone during the performance, not even to try to help them. Within seconds, her body disappeared completely into the floor. The hole closed with a sharp snap, and silence returned. On stage, the man in the black suit raised his hands like a conductor. From one of the platters on the table, a new piece of meat appeared, steaming. He placed it carefully on a plate and carried it to the center of the table. "The meal is complete," he announced triumphantly. And then, as if they were programmed, the audience began clapping again. As the applause echoed, Tyler remained in his trance. His words were louder now, almost decipherable. Amanda looked at me, terrified. "He's not going to stop, Matt," she whispered, clutching my hand tightly. "Don't break the rules," I murmured, trying to convince myself as much as her. On stage, the actors began rearranging the table, preparing for the next act. Deep down, I knew this was far from over. Something terrible was happening. Something that would only get worse if we didn't follow the rules. But Tyler seemed lost. And if he broke one of the rules, I knew he would be the next sacrifice. The performance continued, and the room seemed to grow darker. That was when it hit me, we weren't watching a play. We were part of it. The theater felt more oppressive with each passing second. The air was heavy, and the nauseating scent of incense, or something like it, permeated the room, irritating my senses. Tyler was still muttering incoherent words, but his voice now seemed more distant, as though he were being swallowed by something invisible. Amanda clung to my arm with such force that her nails dug into my skin. "What's happening here, Matt?" she whispered, but before I could respond, a shiver ran down my spine. Something had changed. A low, continuous murmuring began spreading through the audience. It was almost imperceptible at first, but soon it became clear. It wasn't the sound of ordinary voices. It was deeper, more guttural, like a chorus rising from a distant abyss. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and then I saw him. He was sitting across the auditorium in the VIP section, in the back row, almost hidden in the shadows. The first thing I noticed were his eyes. They were completely black, without shine or emotion, yet impossible to ignore. Even in the dim light, I could feel the weight of his gaze fixed on me. The rest of his appearance was equally unsettling. He wore a dark suit, similar to the man on stage, but with subtle details that seemed off. The stitching was crooked, the fabric absorbed light unnaturally. His skin was eerily pale, almost translucent, and his lips were curved into a smile that didn't fit the rest of his face. For a moment, I thought about looking away, but the words of rule number 6 stabbed into my mind like a knife. If you see someone who looks like the devil in the audience, ignore them. They're just a special guest. But how could I ignore something like that? He was staring directly at me, as if he knew I'd noticed him. I held my breath, forcing my gaze back to the stage. Amanda sensed something was wrong. "Matt, what is it? Are you okay? Don't look back," I whispered through clenched teeth. "Just look at the stage." She frowned in confusion but did as I said. My heart raced, and the gaze of the special guest felt like it was burning into the side of my face, even though I wasn't looking directly at him anymore. My mind spiraled with paranoid thoughts. He knew I'd seen him. He knew I was trying to resist. If I flinched, reacted, or broke the rule, what would happen to me? As I struggled to maintain composure, the stage transformed again. The set now depicted a night garden. Skeletal trees and a rusted bench filled the scene. The cold, blue lighting gave the setting a chilling appearance, and a thin fog rolled across the ground. In the center of the stage, one of the actors held a rope. He slowly coiled it around his hands, as if preparing for something. Suddenly, a woman in the audience started to panic. She was seated a few rows ahead of us and seemed completely unhinged. "No, I can't watch this anymore. This is madness," she shouted, springing to her feet. The spotlights instantly illuminated her, silencing the rest of the audience. The woman bolted into the center aisle, racing toward the exit. But as the rules had warned, the doors remained firmly shut. She banged on them desperately, screaming for help. On stage, the actor with the rope approached the edge, still coiling the line in his hands as if it were an extension of his body. Suddenly, the rope came alive, It stretched out toward the woman, slithering like a snake. Before she could react, the rope wrapped around her neck and yanked her to the ground with a sickening thud. She tried to scream, but the sound was choked off. The rope tightened further and further until a loud crack echoed through the theater, the unmistakable sound of bones breaking. Her lifeless body was then slowly hoisted into the air, like a puppet on strings, and dragged back toward the stage. The applause began even before her body vanished completely. People clapped frantically, some even rising to their feet. It was as if the woman's death had been the pinnacle of the performance. Amanda covered her mouth, fighting back a scream. I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrific scene. On stage, the woman's body was placed on the rusted bench, like a gruesome prop. The rope remained coiled around her neck, swaying gently in the invisible breeze that seemed to exist only there. "The sacrifice has been accepted," the man in the black suit declared, smiling at the audience. I couldn't think. I couldn't react. And it was in that moment, amid the frenzied applause, that I felt the gaze of the special guest again. He was staring directly at me once more, his black eyes fixed on mine. My entire body went cold, and a single thought consumed me. He knew I was afraid. The rules were clear, but my mind teetered on the edge of collapse. How much longer could I follow them? The tension in the theater was unbearable. Each scene, each sacrifice pushed the atmosphere into new depths of insanity. The audience, who applauded every atrocity with almost religious fervor, had become part of the nightmare. And I couldn't shake the gaze of the special guest. Even without turning my head, I could feel his black eyes boring into me, as though he were waiting. Amanda was paler than ever, while Tyler seemed increasingly lost in his trance. I knew the worst was yet to come. The stage shifted again. This time, the set was the strangest yet. A circular room with walls covered in mirrors. Every reflection was distorted, as if the mirrors were ancient and warped. In the center of the stage stood a single, empty chair made of rusted iron. The actors emerged from the shadows, their movements slow and deliberate. The veiled woman began singing in a language I couldn't understand, a haunting, hypnotic melody. Suddenly, a scream cut through the air. It was a woman, seated in the middle rows, who had finally succumbed to the pressure. "This is sick. Someone has to stop this," she shouted, standing abruptly. Her voice echoed through the auditorium, and everything froze. The actors on stage stopped moving. The veiled woman's melody ceased instantly, as though sliced away by a blade. Even the audience's applause died out, leaving the room engulfed in an oppressive, suffocating silence. I knew what was about to happen. The man in the black suit turned toward the audience, and something in his expression shifted. He seemed larger now, more imposing, as if the shadows around him had grown. "Silence," he commanded, his voice reverberating through the auditorium. Suddenly, the theater lights began flickering erratically, and a low, guttural sound echoed from the walls, as if the very building were breathing. On stage, the iron chair began to move, scraping against the floor with a shrill, horrible sound. The woman who had screamed instinctively backed away, trying to distance herself from the stage. But the theater lights followed her, illuminating her like a spotlight on a target. The chair didn't just move. It floated into the air, as if pulled by invisible strings, hovering above the audience. The woman fell to her knees, covering her ears as the guttural sound grew louder. Without warning, the chair plummeted, like a predator striking its prey. It landed directly on the woman, pinning her to the ground. She screamed, but her cries were quickly stifled. An unseen force began pressing the chair down on her, bending the iron as if it were paper. Her bones cracked one by one, the sound sickeningly clear as her body was slowly crushed under the impossible weight. The sound was horrifying, a mix of flesh being compressed and metal groaning. And then silence. Her body was unrecognizable, a grotesque mass trapped beneath the mangled remains of the chair. Once again, the applause erupted. It was deafening, as if the audience was in a state of ecstasy. Amanda let out a small sob but quickly covered her mouth, remembering the rules. That was, she began to say, but I cut her off with a look. Speaking wasn't safe. On stage, the man in the black suit raised his hands, calling for silence. The applause stopped almost instantly. He approached the crushed body, crouching to inspect it closely. "Exquisite," he said, smiling. He looked back at the audience, his eyes gleaming with something that resembled pleasure. Each sacrifice strengthens the spectacle. Each broken rule brings us closer to the climax. As the next set began to take shape, a realization hit me. Each death, each sacrifice was part of a pattern. Nothing was random. The spotlights, the shifting sets, even the audience's applause. Everything was perfectly choreographed, as if following an unseen script. I glanced at Tyler. He was still muttering to himself, but now I could make out some of the words. "I can't look away, can't look away." Amanda noticed too. "He's talking about the rules," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That's what they do," I murmured back. "They wait, they manipulate. All of this is designed to break us." As the stage transformed once more, I felt the gaze of the special guest upon me again. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was enough to remind me that I was being watched, evaluated. The show was far from over, and I knew the next death would be even more grotesque. The theater felt more alive than ever. The walls seemed to pulse, the air was thick, and the temperature rose, making each breath heavier. The stage was dark again, but the oppressive sense that something was about to happen pressed against my chest. Amanda grabbed my arm, her face pale and frightened. "Matt, we need to get out of here. Now!" I glanced at Tyler, who was still muttering quietly, lost in his own world. He seemed too far gone to reach. "He won't come with us," Amanda said, as if reading my thoughts. "But we can still leave. Maybe while the stage is empty." I hesitated but knew she was right. Every second we stayed dragged us deeper into the nightmare. I looked around, trying to appear casual. Some people were still clapping, while others whispered among themselves, as if discussing the brilliance of the show. Carefully, Amanda and I stood, avoiding any noise. As we moved toward the side aisle, Tyler didn't follow. His gaze remained fixed on the empty stage, his mouth moving mechanically. The side doors of the auditorium led to a narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering bulbs. The floor was covered with an old, dirty carpet, and the air reeked of mildew mixed with something metallic, perhaps blood. "Matt, this is wrong. All of this is wrong," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, but eventually we came across a partially open door. Inside, what we saw was worse than anything I could have imagined. It was a spacious room, dimly lit by a faint red glow. In one corner, there were mannequins, partially disassembled and draped in clothing that looked as though it had been stripped from the bodies of the dead. But the most horrifying details were at the center of the room. The bodies of the dead audience members, or what was left of them, were displayed there. The man crushed by the chair was now affixed to a metal structure, his flesh grotesquely stitched to create something resembling a sculpture. The elderly woman who had been dragged into the floor was stretched out on a table, her limbs carefully severed and arranged like a macabre decoration. But the worst was the first victim, the man with the twisted neck. His body hung from a rack, his head contorted into an unnatural, horrifying smile. Amanda gagged, covering her mouth with both hands. "Oh my God!" I couldn't speak. My eyes were glued to the scene, trying to comprehend the horror in front of us. Then we heard footsteps. Someone was coming. The door we'd left ajar began to creak, and a shadow appeared in the hallway. Amanda and I backed away, hiding behind a pile of dirty props. It was one of the actors, the tall, thin man with the cracked wooden mask. He entered the room with steady steps, carrying what looked like a box. He began rummaging through the bodies, as though selecting specific parts for some purpose. When he picked up the elderly woman's arm and examined it under the light, my stomach churned. Amanda gripped my arm tightly, and I motioned for her to stay silent. He couldn't see us, but then Amanda stepped on something, a broken piece of wood. The sound was faint, but it was enough to draw the actor's attention. He stopped, tilting his head slowly in our direction. "Who's there?" Before he could get closer, I grabbed Amanda's hand, and we ran. The corridor seemed narrower now, as if it were closing in around us. I could hear heavy, hurried footsteps behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We managed to return to the auditorium, slamming the door shut behind us. The applause resumed the moment we entered. The stage was now lit, and the actors had returned. Amanda and I quickly sat down, trying to blend in, to become invisible. But something was wrong. Tyler was no longer in his seat. I looked around frantically, searching for him, but I didn't need to look for long. Tyler was on the stage. He stood there with vacant eyes as the actors moved around him. The man in the black suit held a ceremonial-looking knife that gleamed under the lights. "A new protagonist," he said, smiling at the audience. Before we could react, two of the other actors grabbed Tyler by the arms, forcing him to kneel. The knife was raised, and the man in the black suit moved like a dancer, circling Tyler with calculated, deliberate steps. The blade slashed across Tyler's neck in one perfect motion, and blood sprayed, painting the stage crimson. The worst part was what happened next. Tyler didn't fall. His body remained upright, and his severed head was held aloft by the man in the black suit, who raised it as though it were a trophy. "Each sacrifice strengthens the spectacle," he proclaimed. Once again, the audience erupted into applause. Amanda began sobbing softly, but I pulled her closer. "Stay calm," I whispered. "They want us to break the rules." But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it was our turn on stage. The theater wouldn't let anyone leave without a sacrifice. The atmosphere in the theater had shifted. It was no longer just fear or tension. It was something deeper, more invasive. A suffocating silence had fallen over the room, and even the murmurs from the audience had ceased. Something invisible seemed to envelop each of us, a crushing weight that made it difficult to breathe. Amanda trembled beside me. Tyler was now just another prop on the stage. His body remained kneeling, his head missing, while the blood around him seemed to move on its own, swirling and shifting like it had a will of its own. "They're not here anymore," Amanda whispered. I looked around and realized what she meant. The audience appeared frozen, but not in fear. Their faces were serene, almost joyful, as they stared intently at the stage. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same reddish light that now filled the theater. The play continued, but the actors were different now. They moved with an inhuman fluidity, their motions unnaturally precise. The man in the black suit took center stage once again, raising his arms like a conductor. The spectacle approaches its climax. Each of you is part of its creation. And now, the next act. At that moment, several people in the audience began to rise, without hesitation, as though summoned. A portly man in a plaid coat, an elderly woman with short hair, and a teenager who looked too young to understand what was happening. All of them walked onto the stage. They moved without protest, without emotion. It was as though they were puppets pulled by invisible strings. On stage, the actors arranged them into a precise formation, positioning them like pieces in a grotesque puzzle. Each one seemed to accept their role, offering no resistance. "They're surrendering," Amanda whispered, her voice cracking. "They don't have a choice," I replied, my stomach churning. Among the hypnotized volunteers was the portly man in the plaid coat. He looked out of place, sweating heavily, yet his face showed no fear, only emptiness. The actors positioned him at the center of the stage, while the other volunteers formed a circle around him. The veiled woman began to sing again, her haunting melody echoing through the theater. The other actors started to dance around the man, their movements rhythmic and animalistic. Slowly, the man began to react. He clutched his head as if something inside him was breaking. His screams were not of physical pain but of an internal struggle, as though he were fighting against something unseen. I can't. Please, no. Suddenly, he stopped. His body went rigid, and his eyes rolled back, revealing only the whites. The man in the black suit stepped forward, holding a small torch with an unnatural blue flame. "The next scene demands sacrifice," he said, pressing the flame against the man's chest. The man's skin didn't burn as I expected. Instead, it began to melt, dissolving like wax. Layers of flesh peeled away, revealing a skeletal structure coated in something metallic that shimmered under the stage lights. It was as if the man wasn't made of flesh and bone but of some grotesque fusion of organic and artificial materials. The audience, still entranced, began to clap, louder and louder, their fervor growing with each grotesque revelation. The man was now little more than an empty shell. The actors rearranged his remains, positioning them as part of the stage set. A grotesque tree with outstretched arms resembling twisted branches. The spectacle advances, the man in the black suit declared as the stage lights dimmed once more. The audience was fully consumed by the trance. Their applause continued for a few moments before abruptly stopping. Amanda clung to my arm, tears streaming down her face. "They're gonna take us next, Matt. We're next," she whispered. "No, we're not," I said, though my words felt hollow even to myself. I looked at the stage, then back at the audience. Some people remained motionless in their seats, but most had already become part of the performance, whether as living participants or lifeless props. The theater had become a machine, consuming everything around it. But then I realized something. "They're following a pattern," I murmured. Amanda looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" "They pick the people who stand out, those who break the rules or react too much." She swallowed hard, understanding the implication. We couldn't draw attention. We had to disappear, become nothing more than shadows in the crowd. But as the stage lit up for the next scene, I saw something that made my breath catch. The special guest. He was still there, in the back row, his black eyes fixed on me. He knew I was struggling, knew I still had control, and now he was waiting for me to break. In the theater of tragedy, no one was just a spectator. The lights on the stage began to dim again, signaling another transition. The audience, still caught in their grotesque trance, remained motionless, waiting for the next act. Amanda squeezed my arm, pulling me back to reality. "If we don't leave now, we're never leaving," she whispered, her tone more resolute than I expected. I glanced at the audience and then at the stage, where the actors were clearing away pieces of the previous set. It was now or never. "Let's go." Carefully, we rose from our seats and slid toward the side of the auditorium. This time, no one seemed to notice. The hallways felt even more claustrophobic than before, the walls slick with some kind of sticky dampness that stained our hands if we brushed against them. Flickering lights overhead cast jagged, irregular shadows that seemed to move on their own. "Matt, do you think we'll make it out of this?" Amanda asked, her breathing heavy as we crossed another corridor intersection. "I don't know," I admitted. Our goal was clear: find any exit or clue to escape this nightmare. But fate seemed to guide us elsewhere. As we turned another corner, we heard voices. "This way," I whispered, pulling Amanda behind a broken, rotting cabinet. The voices came from a large room with slightly ajar double doors. Peering through the crack, we saw the actors gathered together. The man in the black suit stood at the center, his commanding presence undeniable, while the others, the veiled woman, the tall man with the cracked mask, and the hunched actor, clustered around him. Tonight's sacrifices have been productive, the man in the black suit said, his voice echoing through the room. But the show must reach perfection. He is here tonight, and we cannot disappoint him. Him? Amanda whispered softly, but I motioned for her to stay quiet. The veiled woman laughed, a sharp, malicious sound. Humans are so easy to manipulate. A few rules and a bit of theater, and they surrender without a fight. Pathetic. The tall man tilted his head, his cracked mask glinting faintly in the dim light. They carry enough sin to fill the entire theater. Each sacrifice burns it away, leaving their flesh perfect for the master. My heart pounded. They were talking about us, the audience, the survivors. Watch the stragglers, the man in the black suit warned. Two still resist. They are insignificant, but they could cause trouble if left unchecked. Amanda locked eyes with me, her face pale with fear. I pulled her closer, hoping our shallow, nervous breaths wouldn't betray our presence. This place, the man in the black suit continued, is a constant offering to the master. Each scene, each sacrifice, strengthens his presence. He feeds on their sins, turning guilt into fuel for eternity. The veiled woman stepped closer, pulling back part of the fabric covering her face. Her skin was uneven and blotchy, her eyes glowing with a vivid red light. "You talk as if we must please him," she said with a sneer. "We're nothing but tools, puppets in the show he directs." "Careful, Miriam," the man in the black suit snapped, his tone sharp. "We serve him because that's what we are. Demons. Each play we direct, each soul we offer, keeps this theater between worlds and our master satisfied." A cold chill ran down my spine. They weren't human. They were demons. And this place, the theater, was some kind of portal or trap designed to sacrifice sinners and appease the devil. Amanda gripped my hand so tightly I thought my bones might break. "This can't be real," she murmured softly, tears pooling in her eyes. As the demons continued their conversation, a shadow passed close to the door where we were hiding. Amanda froze, but I pulled her further behind the cabinet, trying to stay out of sight. The tall man with the cracked mask stopped near the entrance, tilting his head as if sniffing the air. "They're nearby," he said in a low, menacing voice. My heart pounded so hard I was sure he could hear it. The room fell silent, and for a moment I thought we were caught. But then a voice from within the room called out, "Leave them. They have nowhere to go. Return to the stage." The tall man hesitated but eventually retreated, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. When the voices faded, Amanda and I exchanged a quick, fearful glance. "They know we're here," she whispered, barely holding back her tears. "I know," I replied, my mind racing with the weight of what we had just overheard. As we crept back toward the auditorium, the gravity of our discovery hit me like a brick. This wasn't just a performance. It wasn't just a massacre. It was a ritual. The theater was a space between worlds, a machine of torment where souls were sacrificed to appease the devil. Every rule, every death, was part of a meticulously planned spectacle, an endless cycle of pain and punishment. When we returned to our seats, the stage was already lit again. The demons were there, prepared for the next act. And at the back of the theater, the special guest, surely the devil himself, watched us with that empty, knowing smile. The audience was nearly empty now. Only a handful of people remained seated, their faces motionless, like wax dolls. I couldn't tell if they were alive, dead, or simply trapped in the horrible trance that gripped this place. The stage had changed again. There were no tables or chairs, just an expanse of shadows broken by fragments of what seemed to be a maze of mirrors, their distorted reflections creating disorienting illusions. The man in the black suit stood at the center, flanked by the other actors in a perfect circle. He raised his hands, his voice booming and resonant, filling every corner of the theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, the spectacle has reached its climax. You, the last few, will have the privilege of participating in the final act. This is no longer a show to watch. It is a game of survival. Before we could process his words, the auditorium doors creaked open with an ear-splitting groan. Amanda clung to my arm, her eyes wide with terror. We weren't alone anymore, for others were with us now. 2 men and 2 women, all of them looking as terrified as we were. You are the chosen ones for the final act, continued the man in the black suit. Each of you carries your own sins, but only the most worthy may continue. The game is simple: run, hide, fight if you must. But remember, no one escapes judgment. The lights in the auditorium began to flicker wildly, and a low, guttural sound reverberated through the floor, as though something massive was awakening. "And let the judgment begin," he said, smiling. The ceiling lights burst, one by one, plunging the theater into darkness. A spotlight beamed down onto the stage, illuminating a winding corridor of mirrors that had magically appeared where there had been nothing before. "Matt, we can't do this," Amanda said, her voice trembling. "We don't have a choice," I replied, pulling her toward the corridor. The others hesitated before following. The hallways felt endless, their mirrored walls reflecting distorted images that showed things that weren't there. My own reflection seemed to stare back at me with a smile I wasn't making, and at times, there was no reflection at all. "What is this?" one of the men asked. He was young, maybe in his 30s, his expression flickering between panic and despair. "It's a game," I murmured, "and they'll kill anyone who doesn't follow the rules." "As if that matters," he shouted, but before he could continue, a scream echoed through the corridors. One of the women, a gray-haired lady who had been in shock since the beginning, had separated from the group. When we turned to look, we saw her reflection in the mirrors. But something was wrong. Her reflection moved before she did. In the glass, she was smiling, though in reality, tears streamed down her face. Then the reflection stepped out of the mirror. The creature looked like her but distorted, as if hastily painted by a deranged artist. Its skin was too wrinkled, its eyes were black voids, and its teeth were jagged shards of glass. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged at the woman, its misshapen hands wrapping around her throat. She tried to scream, but the creature opened its mouth and began to suck something from her. It wasn't blood, it was light. A pale glow seeped from her body, and within seconds, she was left a withered husk, empty and lifeless. "Oh my God," Amanda murmured as I dragged her away from the scene. The corridors began shifting again, the mirrors moving as if they had a mind of their own. As we ran, the voice of the man in the black suit echoed through the theater. She lived a life of lies. She built an empire of deceit, destroyed families, broke promises. Thus she was judged. His words lingered in the air, like a final sentence. "They're killing us for our sins," Amanda said, her voice shaking. "That's what they do," I replied. "They turn it all into a spectacle to please the devil." There were only 5 of us left now. As we ran through the constantly shifting corridors, I realized we were being watched. Not by the mirrors, but by something else. Whispers echoed from all directions, and at times, I saw glowing eyes peering from the darkness. The theater was alive, and we were its prey. "We're not going to survive this, Matt," Amanda said, her voice low and resigned. "I'll find a way out," I promised, even though I knew it was a lie. Deep down, I knew the theater wouldn't let anyone leave, not without a price, and the next sacrifice was coming. I could feel it. The mirrored corridors continued shifting, forcing us into paths seemingly chosen by the theater itself. Amanda and I kept running, aimless and desperate, as the other 3 survivors became scattered throughout the maze. Suddenly, the mirrors disappeared, revealing a vast, empty space. It was as if the entire theater had guided us to this single location. In the center of the space, the man in the black suit was waiting. He smiled at us, but his eyes gleamed with a dark, insatiable hunger. "Welcome to the final act," he said. Behind him, the other actors emerged from the shadows, their forms now completely demonic. There was no longer any pretense of humanity. Their bodies were twisted, with elongated limbs and faces sculpted by chaos itself. The man in the black suit raised his arms, his voice thundering through the room. 3 sacrifices remain before the curtain falls. Let the spectacle continue. The 3 other survivors stumbled into the space, as if they too had been guided there. Before anyone could react, a young woman, perhaps in her 20s, sprinted toward the man in the black suit, screaming, "I won't be part of this. Let me out." She didn't even get close. The veiled woman moved with inhuman speed, grabbing the young woman by the neck. She lifted her into the air and whispered something in her ear. The young woman's body began to change. Her skin cracked like porcelain, revealing a golden light beneath. Within seconds, she transformed into a golden statue, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. The actors placed the statue in the center of the makeshift stage, and, as always, the applause erupted. "The sinner of vanity has been judged," the man in the black suit declared. One of the remaining survivors, an older man in a cheap suit drenched in sweat, began muttering to himself, "I'm not going to die here. I'm not going to die here." He bolted in the opposite direction, trying to escape, but the ground beneath him opened. He fell into a pit of flames that appeared from nowhere. His screams echoed through the theater, but no one moved to help. The man in the black suit spoke again. "Greed consumes all it touches." The flames vanished, leaving only ashes where the man had been. The final survivor, a middle-aged woman who had been with us from the start, fell to her knees and began begging. "Please, no. I did what I had to do. It was to survive." The mirrors around her began to glow, showing reflections of moments from her life. Betrayals, lies, broken promises. Each image seemed to cut her, both physically and emotionally. She screamed as the reflections closed in on her, crushing her like shards of real glass. When the mirrors disappeared, so did she. The sin of betrayal echoes beyond death, the man in the black suit intoned. Now it was just Amanda and me. I knew the theater wouldn't open its doors without a final sacrifice. But I also knew I couldn't let Amanda die. "Matt," Amanda began, but I interrupted her. "Trust me," I said, my mind racing. As the actors began advancing toward us, I raised my voice. "Wait!" The man in the black suit stopped, intrigued. "I offer myself as a sacrifice. Let her go. I accept the judgment." Amanda screamed, "No, Matt, don't do this." But I pushed her back, holding my ground against the man in the black suit. He smiled, satisfied. "A voluntary sacrifice is always welcome." The actors started moving toward me, but at the last second, I grabbed Amanda's hand and bolted toward the mirrors. "No!" The man in the black suit roared, and the entire theater shook. I knew the theater followed its own rules, and I gambled that breaking the ritual would create enough of a distraction. We ran through the corridors, the mirrors shattering around us. The entire theater seemed to be falling apart, but in the distance we saw the exit doors open. "Run, Amanda!" We leapt through the doors and into the cool night air. When we turned around, the Mayfair Theater was gone. For days, Amanda and I avoided talking about what had happened. I wanted to believe we had escaped, but deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The confirmation came a week later, when Amanda called me, her voice trembling with fear. "Matt, I looked up the Mayfair Theater." "Why would you do that, Amanda?" "It wasn't just here. The same theater appeared in other cities. People disappeared everywhere it showed up. And some of the people we saw inside, they've been missing for decades." The weight of her words hit me like a ton of bricks. The spectacle was an eternal cycle, moving from town to town, feeding on the sins of its victims. I stared out the window of my apartment, trying to find comfort in the calm night. But then, I saw something that sent a chill down my spine. In the glass reflection, there was a cracked wooden mask.